Nora Calloway had learned early in life that silence was the safest response to cruelty. She had learned it at 7 years old, sitting on a hard plastic chair in a hallway that smelled of bleach and overcooked vegetables, watching other children carry small suitcases out the front door of the Clover Hill Children's Home while she stayed behind. She had learned it at 12 when a foster placement ended without explanation, and she returned to that same hallway carrying the same worn backpack. She had learned it at 17 when she overheard one of the caseworkers say, "Some kids just don't get chosen," in the same casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. By the time she was 24 years old, silence had become so natural to her that most people mistook it for coldness. It was not coldness. It was armor carefully constructed, tested over years, and worn so long she had nearly forgotten it was there. She was wearing it now. The conference room on the 14th floor of Whitfield and Associates occupied the corner of a glass building in downtown Roanoke, Virginia, and on the morning of December 3rd, it held 9 people seated around a long mahogany table. There were attorneys and their assistants. There were financial advisors. There were 2 men in expensive suits who had arrived in separate cars despite living in the same city, and a woman in a tailored wool blazer who had not looked up from her phone since sitting down. And there was Nora seated at the far end of the table in a chair that was slightly smaller than the others, wearing a dark blue coat she had bought secondhand 3 winters ago. She did not belong at this table. Every person in the room understood that, including her. Harlan Calloway had died 6 weeks earlier on the 14th of October from a cardiac event that his doctors described as sudden and unsurvivable. He was 68 years old. He had built a moderately successful real estate development company over 4 decades of methodical, unglamorous work. He had owned a lakefront house on Smith Mountain Lake, a cattle ranch outside Lexington, a collection of pre-war American antiques and investment accounts that his attorney, a thin man named Gerald Whitfield, was now carefully enumerating in a voice designed to project both gravity and efficiency. Nora had met Harlan Calloway exactly 4 times in her life. The first time she was 9. He had arrived at the children's home unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, holding a birthday card 3 days late and a gift-wrapped box that turned out to contain a children's book about mountain wildlife. She remembered his hands more than his face. Large, weathered hands, the hands of a man who had spent years working outdoors before transitioning to boardrooms. He had sat across a small table from her in the common room and spoken in short, careful sentences, the way someone speaks when they are not sure which words are safe. She had given him monosyllabic answers. The visit lasted 40 minutes. He did not come back for 2 years. The second time she was 11. A phone call, not a visit. His voice on the line sounded different than she remembered. Tighter, more formal. He asked how school was going. She said fine. He said that was good. The call lasted 6 minutes and ended with him saying he hoped she was taking care of herself, which struck her even then as a strange thing to say to an 11-year-old who had no one to take care of her. The third time she was 16. Another brief visit, another card, another conversation that circled around everything important without ever landing on any of it. She had spent the weeks before that visit telling herself she no longer cared. She had spent the days after convincing herself she had been right. The fourth time was at his funeral, where she stood at the back of a crowded church in Roanoke and watched 2 men she barely knew weep openly in the front pew, while a pastor spoke about a man Nora felt she had never actually met. Now Gerald Whitfield was clearing his throat. Prescott Calloway, seated to Whitfield's right, leaned back slightly in his chair. He was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with the brand of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from never having seriously doubted one's place in the world. He was a corporate attorney himself, which meant he understood exactly what was happening in this room and had likely reviewed the documents in advance. Beside him sat Reed Calloway, 42, thinner and quieter than his older brother, a man who had always seemed to exist slightly in Prescott's shadow without appearing to mind very much. Neither of them had acknowledged Nora when she entered the room. Not a nod, not a glance, not even the polite, uncomfortable smile strangers exchange in elevators. She had taken her seat at the far end of the table, and they had continued their conversation as though the chair she occupied had simply remained empty. Gerald Whitfield read through the distribution of the estate with the methodical precision of a man billing by the hour. The Smith Mountain Lake property went to Prescott. The investment accounts were divided with a larger portion going to Prescott and the remainder to Reed. The cattle ranch outside Lexington went to Prescott. The antique collection appraised at just under $200,000 was divided between the two brothers. There were smaller provisions for charitable donations, stipends for two longtime employees, and a bequest to the local historical society that Harlan had apparently supported for decades without mentioning it to anyone. Nora sat with her hands folded on the table and her expression arranged into the careful blankness she had spent years perfecting. She was not surprised. She had told herself before entering this building that she was not coming for anything. She was coming because the attorney had sent a certified letter requesting her presence, and she had decided that refusing to appear would feel like a surrender of a different kind. Gerald Whitfield cleared his throat again. "There is one final item in the estate," he said. Prescott was already reaching for his phone. "A property Whitfield continued located in Augusta County, Virginia, in the community of Cedar Ridge. The parcel consists of a residential cabin and approximately 40 surrounding acres of mountain woodland." Prescott looked up from his phone. Something shifted in his expression almost imperceptibly. Reed glanced at his brother. "This property," Whitfield said, "is bequeathed in its entirety to Nora Calloway." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that no one was entirely expecting. And then Prescott laughed. It was not a cruel laugh precisely. It was the laugh of a man who finds something so obviously absurd that his amusement is almost involuntary. He caught himself after a moment, pressed his lips together, and looked back down at his phone. But the damage was done. The woman in the wool blazer covered a smile. One of the financial advisors studied the ceiling. Reed said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. Nora looked at the surface of the mahogany table. 40 acres and a cabin," Prescott said, as though he were reading from a list of things that did not matter. Dad always had a sense of humor. No one responded to that directly, but the silence that followed was permissive. Nora accepted the property documents from Gerald Whitfield without speaking. She signed where she was told to sign. She folded the documents into her bag, stood up, and left the conference room without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one in that room she had ever actually said hello to. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before starting the engine. She was not crying. She had made a decision years ago about crying in parking garages, and she intended to keep it. She pulled out of the garage and drove. The drive from Roanoke to Cedar Ridge took just over 2 hours under normal conditions, but the weather on that particular December morning was not offering normal conditions. The forecast had called for light snow in the higher elevations. The mountains had not consulted the forecast. By the time Nora turned off the main interstate and began climbing into the Appalachians on Route 250, the snow was falling in thick, purposeful curtains that eliminated the distinction between sky and landscape. The road ahead of her appeared and disappeared in segments revealed by her headlights for a few seconds before being swallowed again by white. She drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, leaning slightly forward in the way people do when they are trying to see through something that does not want to be seen through. The radio had lost its signal 40 minutes earlier. Her phone showed no bars. The GPS had recalculated twice and then stopped recalculating. She was navigating now by the direction she had memorized from the property documents and by the occasional weathered road sign that emerged from the snow like a word half remembered. The landscape changed as she climbed. The valley farms and gentle hills of the lower elevation gave way to dense forest, steep ridge lines, and the kind of silence that has weight to it. Bare trees rose on both sides of the road, their branches white with accumulated snow, their trunks dark and patient. The world contracted. The highway had become a two-lane road, and the two-lane road had become something narrower still, lined on one side by a rocky embankment and on the other by a drop she preferred not to look at directly. She passed a rusted metal sign she almost missed: Cedar Ridge, Unincorporated Community Population 380. She slowed the car and looked through the windshield at what the sign was announcing. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place that exists in the spaces between larger American stories. A white clapboard church at the top of a small rise, its steeple dark against the pale sky. A gas station with a single pump and a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising bait and ice. Three pickup trucks parked in a diagonal line in front of a building that appeared to be simultaneously a hardware store, a post office, and something else she could not immediately identify. Smoke rising from chimneys in thin vertical columns that the wind had not yet found. Snow on everything covering everything, making everything look like it was under the same quiet spell. There was no traffic, there were no pedestrians. The whole town appeared to be conducting its December quietly and without particular concern for outside observation. Nora pulled into the small gravel lot beside the building with the multiple functions. A wooden sign above the door read Greer's General in letters that had been repainted recently enough that they were still legible. A string of plain white lights framed the door, not festively exactly, but not without warmth either. She sat in the car for a moment. She had no real reason to stop here. The property documents contained a rough map, and according to her calculations, the cabin was approximately 4 more miles up a road that veered left past a creek crossing. But 4 miles in this weather on roads she did not know felt like a commitment she was not ready to make without confirming she was going in the right direction. And if she were being honest with herself, which she tried to be even when it was uncomfortable, she was also not entirely ready to arrive. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately and completely, the kind of December mountain cold that hits all at once and means it. She pulled her coat tighter and crossed the lot to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The bell above the door was brass and old, and produced a sound that was somehow both small and significant, the way sounds are in quiet places. The interior of Greer's General was narrow and dense, stocked with the logic of a store that serves a community whose nearest large retailer is 40 minutes away. Shelves of canned goods and hardware supplies and over-the-counter medicines and hunting accessories occupied the same floor space with the comfortable disorder of things arranged by necessity rather than category. A small wood stove in the back corner was producing serious heat. The smell of the place was coffee and pine resin, and something baked, maybe cornbread, maybe biscuits, and beneath it all the deeper smell of old wood and decades. Behind the wooden counter at the far end of the store, a man was reading a newspaper. He was in his early 70s, solidly built in the way of men who have spent their lives doing physical work, with white hair cut close and a face that had been seriously weathered by time and elements into something that looked less like aging and more like seasoning. His hands on the newspaper were large and capable. He wore a dark flannel shirt and had the general air of a man who has been exactly where he is for a very long time and has no complaints about that. He looked up when this bell rang. He looked at Nora. Something happened in his expression. It was subtle, the kind of shift that someone who was not paying attention would not notice. But Nora had spent her entire life paying attention to the expressions of people who held information she did not have, and she noticed it immediately. It was not surprise. It was closer to recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing they have been expecting without knowing exactly when it would arrive. He set the newspaper down carefully, folding it in half along the original crease. "You must be Harlan's daughter," he said. Nora stopped walking. The words landed differently than they should have. They were simple words, a reasonable guess from a man in a small town who perhaps knew everyone's business, who had perhaps heard about Harlan Calloway's death and the reading of his will and who might be arriving. That was the reasonable explanation. But no one had ever introduced her that way before. Not once in 24 years. Not as Harlan Calloway's daughter. Not as anyone's daughter. She had been introduced as a ward, as a resident, as a case number, as a scholarship recipient, as an employee, as a tenant. She had introduced herself as Nora Calloway so many times that the name had become something she wore rather than something she was. Harlan's daughter. She stood in the middle of the store and felt the words rearrange something she had believed was fixed. "I'm Nora," she said finally. The man nodded as though this confirmed rather than informed. "I know who you are." She crossed the remaining distance to the counter slowly. The old man came around from behind the counter and extended his hand. Amos Greer. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who means it. He looked at her steadily with the directness of a man who has reached an age where he no longer sees the point of looking at anything sideways. Your father came through Cedar Ridge every month, he said. For 15 years, give or take. Stopped in here every time, usually for coffee, sometimes for supplies, always to talk. Nora looked at him. Every month, every month. She thought about that. 15 years of monthly visits. Harlan Calloway driving up into these mountains on roads that turn treacherous in winter, stopping at a general store in a town with a population of 380 people. She thought about all the phone calls he had not made, all the visits that had not happened, all the birthdays that had passed without a card arriving, without a voice on the phone, without any evidence that the man whose name appeared on her birth certificate was doing anything other than living his life in a direction entirely away from hers. And she thought about him driving this road every month for 15 years. What did he talk about, she asked. Amos Greer looked at her with an expression that was careful and kind in equal measure. Many things he said. He paused. But most often he talked about you. Nora did not speak for a moment. She was aware of the wood stove in the corner and the snow against the windows and the smell of coffee and pine, and she was aware of something else, a sensation she could not immediately name that had begun somewhere in the middle of her chest and was not entirely unpleasant. I don't understand that, she said. I know, Amos said. He walked back behind the counter and poured a cup of coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting for a while. He set it on the counter and pushed it toward her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up. He knew you went to Harmon County High School, Amos said. He knew you got a partial scholarship to Roanoke College. He knew you worked 2 jobs your sophomore year to cover the rest of the tuition. He knew you changed your major from education to social work in your junior year. He said he thought that made sense given everything. Nora's hand tightened slightly around the cup. How did he know those things? Amos shrugged a small, careful gesture. He found ways. He did not say more than that. She stared at the surface of the counter. The coffee was too strong and slightly burnt, and she drank it anyway. Did he ever say why he didn't? She started and then stopped because she was not sure how to finish the question without it sounding like what it actually was, which was 24 years of a wound she had decided did not need a name. Amos looked at her steadily. He said that was something you'd have to find the answer to yourself. She set the cup down. That's not a very satisfying answer. No, Amos agreed. But I think he believed the cabin would do a better job explaining than he could. She almost asked what he meant by that. Then she decided she would find out. Amos produced a hand-drawn map from beneath the counter, the kind made on a piece of plain white paper with a ruler and a black pen marked with landmarks. The creek crossing the old fence line, the lightning-struck oak that apparently still stood at the property boundary, and a small rectangle labeled Calloway at the end of a road that had no name on any official record she had seen. He told her to take it slowly on the last half mile. He told her the porch light was on a timer and would come on at 4:30. He told her there was firewood stacked along the left side of the cabin under a tarp, and that the flue on the stone fireplace needed to be opened counterclockwise rather than clockwise, which was the opposite of every other flue she would likely encounter in her life. He said this last thing with the gravity of a man for whom practical information is a form of care. She thanked him. She meant it. She drove the remaining 4 miles in the gathering dark of a December afternoon that was collapsing into evening faster than the calendar strictly justified. The road narrowed. The trees pressed closer. The snow had layered itself over everything with the slow thoroughness of something that has nowhere else to be and all winter to get there. She crossed the creek on a bridge made of wooden planks that drummed under her tires in a way that suggested they were doing their best but would appreciate being replaced in the near future. And then as she came around a long curve between 2 rows of hemlocks that had grown so tall, they formed something like a hallway, she saw it. The cabin. It stood at the edge of a clearing that the snow had turned into something almost lunar in its pale, undisturbed expanse. The structure was older than she had expected, built from dark logs that had been weathered by decades of mountain seasons, into the kind of deep burnished brown that only comes from genuine exposure. The porch ran the full width of the front face, its boards sagging slightly at one end, in a way that was more character than damage. The roof was steep and asymmetrical, the kind of design that evolved from function rather than aesthetics, built to shed snow, built to last. A stone chimney rose from the left side of the structure, dark and cold. At 4:30 exactly, a light came on above the porch door. Nora sat in her car with the engine running and looked at the cabin through the windshield for longer than she would later be willing to admit. She was not sure what she had expected. Something more derelict, perhaps, something that would confirm the laughter in the conference room, something she could look at and say, yes, this is what I was worth. But the cabin did not look like a joke. It looked like something that had been tended to. It looked like something that mattered to someone. She turned off the engine. The cold reached her immediately when she stepped out, but the wind had dropped with the evening, and in its absence, the silence was extraordinary. No traffic, no neighbors, no ambient hum of any kind. Just the faint sound of her own footsteps in the snow and the distant, irregular drip of snowmelt from a branch somewhere in the trees. She climbed the porch steps. Each one announced her weight with a creak that rose and fell in a different pitch, like a chord being played badly by someone learning an instrument. She found the key where the attorney's documents said it would be, in a small lockbox mounted to the right of the doorframe. The code was Harlan Calloway's birth year. She punched it in, retrieved the key, and stood for a moment with it in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of the cabin was the first thing. Cedar and dust and old paper and something underlying all of that. Something she could not immediately identify, that was neither unpleasant nor familiar, but was specific, the unmistakable scent of a space long inhabited by one person. The beam of her flashlight swept the room in a slow arc. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, flanked by a low wood box and a pair of iron andirons that had been hand-forged rather than manufactured. A leather chair, dark brown and deeply worn, sat at an angle to the fireplace, in the position of something that has not been moved in years, but has been used almost daily. Bookshelves occupied one entire wall, their contents organized with a care that suggested their owner had strong opinions about where things belonged. A braided wool rug covered most of the floor. A narrow kitchen occupied the back third of the main room, with a cast iron stove, a wooden table with two chairs, and a set of open shelves that held canned goods, dry goods, and a row of mason jars, whose contents had been labeled in handwriting she did not yet recognize. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but nothing was damaged. Nothing was disordered. The fireplace tools were clean. The books on the shelves were upright. The kitchen table had been wiped down before whoever last used it had left for the final time. Nora walked slowly through the room. She opened closets. She looked through kitchen cabinets. She climbed the narrow staircase to the upper floor, where she found two small bedrooms and a bathroom, with a clawfoot tub and a window that looked out over the clearing and the dark tree line beyond it. She searched without quite knowing what she was searching for, with the thoroughness of someone who has learned not to expect to find what they are looking for, but also cannot stop looking. She found nothing she could not explain. On the way back through the main room, she stopped at the fireplace. She found the tarp-covered woodpile where Amos had said it would be and brought in enough logs to start a fire. She opened the flue counterclockwise. The fire took on the third attempt and grew quickly, filling the room with the kind of heat that felt personal rather than mechanical. She stood in front of it for a moment, holding her hands out toward the flames. And then she saw the photograph on the mantel. It sat in a simple wooden frame, pushed slightly to one side, as though it had been moved recently and not quite returned to its original position. She picked it up. The image showed two people standing in front of the cabin on a summer day, the trees behind them full and green, the clearing thick with tall grass. One of them was a man she recognized as a younger version of Harlan Calloway, perhaps in his late 40s. His face relaxed in a way she had never seen in any of the photographs from the funeral. Beside him stood an elderly woman, white-haired and small, with the straight posture of someone who had been told to stand up straight so many times as a child that it became permanent. They were both smiling at whoever held the camera with the easy comfort of people who are entirely at home. Nora turned the frame over. On the back, written in ink that had faded to the color of old tea, were 4 words: "Keep the fire burning." She stood with the photograph in her hands and looked at the fire and then back at the photograph for a long moment. The phrase was simple. It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing or could mean everything, and she could not tell yet which it was. She set the frame back on the mantel and stepped away. She ate a granola bar she found at the bottom of her bag and made instant coffee on the small gas burner with the supplies she had brought from the car. She wrapped herself in a wool blanket from the upstairs closet and sat in the leather chair by the fire. The logs shifted and settled. The wind had returned outside and was moving through the tree line in long, uneven passes. Snow tapped against the windows in a rhythmic, irregular way that suggested patience rather than urgency. She did not fall asleep easily, which was not unusual for her. She had never been a person who fell asleep easily in new places. She lay in the chair and listened to the fire and the wind and the vocabulary of the cabin settling around its heat, the tick and groan and whisper of old wood doing what old wood does in the cold. Sometime after midnight she woke. She did not know why at first. The fire had burned low. The room was darker, lit only by the orange glow of the remaining coals. The cabin was quiet, and then it was not. A sound from the kitchen. A single creak, low and deliberate, the kind of sound that a floor makes when weight is placed on it and then carefully removed. Not the ambient sound of a settling structure. A sound with intention. She sat up. She listened. Nothing. She picked up her flashlight from the floor beside the chair and crossed the room to the kitchen doorway. The beam cut through the dark and moved across the surfaces methodically. The table, the stove, the shelves, the back door which was closed and locked. The row of mason jars, their contents shadowed. Nothing appeared out of place. She was about to turn back when the flashlight beam moved across the floor and stopped. A single floorboard centered in the space between the kitchen table and the back wall sat fractionally higher than the boards on either side of it. The difference was small enough that in daylight or with overhead lighting, she might not have noticed it at all. But in the angled beam of a flashlight, the shadow it created was clear. The board rose perhaps a quarter-inch above its neighbors, and along its edge, where it met the adjoining plank, there was a gap that the others did not have. She crossed the kitchen and knelt beside it. Years of accumulated dust had gathered in the gap, but when she brushed her palm along the board's edge and felt its length, her fingers found something metal, small, set flush into the wood on the far edge. She cleared the dust with her sleeve and shone the flashlight directly onto it. A ring, iron dark with age, folded flat against the surface of the board so that it lay nearly flush. A handle. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrapped her fingers around the ring, felt the cold of the iron in her palm, and pulled. The board lifted with a long, low groan, the sound of something that has been in one position for a very long time being disturbed from its rest. A second board was attached beneath the first, and then a third, and what she had taken for a single plank was in fact a fitted hatch, perhaps 2 feet square, that rose as one piece on a hidden hinge. Cold air came up from below, earthen and still, carrying with it the smell of stone and old paper, and something else she could not name but recognized immediately as important. She shone the flashlight into the opening. Stone walls, wooden stairs descending into the dark. The stairs were old but solid, fitted together with careful carpentry built to last. They descended perhaps 12 feet before opening into a space that the flashlight could not fully illuminate from above. Nora did not move for a moment. She was not afraid, or at least not afraid in the way the word usually means. What she felt was more complex than fear. It was the feeling of standing at the exact edge of something she could not yet see, knowing, with a certainty she could not rationally justify, that what was waiting below would cost her something. That once she went down those stairs, the story she had spent 24 years telling herself about her life The story in which Harlan Calloway was simply a man who had chosen not to be her father would no longer be the only story available to her. She had survived on that story. It was not a comfortable story, but it was a complete one. It had sharp edges, but they were edges she knew by touch. Whatever was at the bottom of those stairs would have different edges. She went down anyway. Each step announced itself under her weight in a different register, the treads flexing slightly but holding the staircase descending in a straight line to a concrete floor that was dry and swept clean. She reached the bottom and raised the flashlight. The underground room was perhaps 12 feet by 15, its walls made of fieldstone mortared carefully, its ceiling supported by rough-hewn beams set with obvious attention to both function and longevity. Metal shelving units lined three walls, the kind sold in hardware stores for garages and storage rooms, but arranged here with a precision that spoke of long-term planning. On the shelves sat boxes, dozens of them, most made of cardboard, but some of wood, each one labeled in the same handwriting she had seen on the mason jars upstairs. The labels were dates, years, not months. They began with a box labeled 2000 and ended with one labeled 2023. 24 boxes for 24 years. In the corner of the room, a battery-powered lantern sat on a shelf with a sticky note attached to it. Batteries replaced October 2023. She pressed the button. It came on immediately, flooding the room with clean white light. She saw the room properly for the first time. It was not a storage space. It was not a cellar. It had been built over what must have been months or years of careful, deliberate work as exactly what it was: an archive, a repository, a record of something that someone had decided was important enough to spend an entire lifetime protecting. The boxes were organized by year. The shelves were labeled. A small wooden desk sat against the fourth wall with a straight-back chair pulled up to it, and on the surface of the desk, positioned with a care that was unmistakable, as if it had been placed there recently, and with intention rather than left behind by accident, sat a single leather-bound journal. Nora walked to the desk. She stood in front of the journal for a long moment without touching it. The cover was dark brown, softened with handling, the leather worn smooth at the corners and along the spine. The journal had been opened and closed many times over many years. Someone had lived with this object in the way you live with something that matters. She sat down in the chair. She placed her hands flat on the surface of the desk on either side of the journal and looked at it. Then she picked it up and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was in black ink, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who took the act of writing seriously. The letters were slightly formal, leaning right, consistent in size, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was still taught as though it mattered. There was one sentence on the first page. "If you are reading this, Nora, then you finally found what I spent my life protecting." She read it once. She read it a second time. She sat very still in the chair in the underground room while the lantern hummed softly and the cold stone walls held the silence around her, and the fire upstairs burned down to its embers without her noticing. Then she turned to the second page. The first journal entry was dated October 2006. Nora had been 6 years old in October 2006. The entry was brief. "I drove past her school today. She was laughing with another girl at the front gate. I wanted to stop. God knows I wanted to. I sat in the car on the opposite side of the road and watched her for maybe 2 minutes before someone behind me honked and I had to move. She didn't see me. I don't know if that's better or worse. She is 6 years old and she already has a laugh that looks like it comes from somewhere real. I don't know who she got that from. I should not have come this far. Vera will ask where I was. I will tell her I had a site visit in Staunton and the roads were slow on the way back. That is what I have become. She deserves the truth." Nora closed the journal. She did not close it because she did not want to read further. She closed it because she needed a moment in which the words she had just read were allowed to exist in the room with her before any additional words joined them. She needed to sit with the simple, shattering fact of what she had just learned. Her father had seen her. Not metaphorically, not abstractly, not in the distant theoretical way of a man who acknowledges a child's existence from far away. He had been there, on that street, in that car, watching her laugh at the front gate of her elementary school. And then he had driven away. The room was quiet. Above her, through 12 feet of earth and floorboards and old wood, the embers in the stone fireplace were still giving off heat. Outside, the snow was still falling. Cedar Ridge was still sleeping. The mountains were still doing what mountains do, which is to say they were waiting as they had always waited for whoever came to them next. Nora set the journal back on the desk. She looked at the shelves around her. 24 boxes, one for each year of her life, each one labeled in her father's careful hand, each one containing something he had decided she needed to know. She had told herself, driving up those mountain roads in the snow, that she would spend one night and then make a decision about the property. She would look at it, assess it, and then decide whether it was worth anything to anyone. That was not what was going to happen. She knew that now, in the way you know certain things when you are standing in a room that has been built specifically for the moment you are standing in it. She was not going to make any decisions tonight. She was not going to make any decisions tomorrow. She was going to sit in this chair and read, and she was going to read until she understood. She opened the journal again. She turned to the second entry, and the mountains held their silence around her patient, and enormous as they had held it for 100 million years before she arrived, and would hold it long after all of this was finished, because mountains do not require things to be resolved in order to find peace with them. They only require that someone be present to witness them honestly. Nora Calloway had spent 24 years learning to be honest about things that hurt. She was finally in the right place to use that skill. She read through the night. That was the only way to describe what happened in the hours that followed, though the phrase itself felt insufficient for the experience of sitting in a stone-walled room 12 feet below the surface of a mountain and working your way through the written interior life of a man you had spent 2 decades believing did not think about you. She read the way people do things when they have been waiting for them their entire lives without knowing they were waiting. With a focus so complete that the physical world reduced itself to the minimum required for continuance. The cold of the room, the white light of the lantern, the pages turning under her hands. Harlan Calloway had kept a journal for 24 years. Not every entry was long. Some were a single paragraph, a single observation jotted down in the margins of whatever day he had been living. Some were written in clean, considered prose, with the assurance of a man who had been sitting with a thought long enough to know how to say it. Others were shorter, rougher the handwriting, less careful, written in what she recognized as the urgency of someone who needs to put something down before it becomes something they cannot say at all. But certain things recurred. She appeared in them constantly. He knew when she graduated from middle school. He wrote about it in an entry dated June 2012, describing in terms that were both specific and inexplicable, given the distance between them, the expression on her face in a photograph that had appeared in the Clover Hill Children's Home newsletter, a publication with a circulation of perhaps 200 people, none of whom should have included Harlan Calloway of Roanoke, Virginia. He knew she had been moved to a different foster placement in the fall of 2013 and that it had not worked out. He did not say how he knew. He wrote only, "I heard about the Hendersons. I should have done something. I do not know what I would have done, but I should have tried harder to find out." He knew she had applied to 4 colleges and been accepted to 3. He knew which one she chose and why. He knew she had studied social work and that she had changed her major in her junior year, and he had written about that decision with an admiration that was completely unguarded. The admiration of someone watching a person make a correct choice about themselves and feeling proud in a way that had nowhere to go. "She deserves the truth," he wrote at the end of that entry. He had written it before. He would write it again. By the time the first gray light began filtering through the cabin floorboards above her, Nora had read through 15 journals. She had learned more about her father in one night than she had learned in 24 years of occasional awkward contact. She had learned that he took his coffee with no sugar and too much cream, and that he considered this a personal failing. She had learned that he had strong opinions about the proper way to stack firewood and believed most people did it wrong. She had learned that he had read to her mother from a novel about the Shenandoah Valley in the final weeks of her pregnancy and believed in the way that people believe things they cannot prove, that this was why Nora had an instinct for language. She had learned that he had never stopped thinking about her for a single year of the 24 she had been alive. She climbed the stairs as the cabin began to fill with morning light. She added wood to the fireplace, filled a pot of water on the gas burner, and stood at the kitchen window watching snow move across the clearing in small horizontal gusts while the water heated. The mountains were visible now, pale blue and enormous in the distance, their upper ridges dissolving into a sky the color of old pewter. A pair of crows moved across the clearing below the tree line, picking at something in the snow with the purposeful unhurriedness of birds who have no competing obligations. She drank her coffee standing up. She went back downstairs. She read for 3 more days. Not continuously and not without interruption. She slept in the leather chair by the fire in intervals of 2 and 3 hours, waking to add wood, waking to eat the simple food she had brought from the car and supplemented with canned goods she found in the kitchen, waking sometimes in the middle of the night with the disorientation of someone whose internal clock has been superseded by something more demanding than sleep schedules. She drove into Cedar Ridge once to buy groceries and to fill her gas tank at the station with a single pump, and Amos Greer watched her come and go from behind the counter of his store without asking questions, which was one of the things she was beginning to understand she liked about him. Each time she returned to the underground room, she knew more than she had known before. Each time she climbed back into the lantern light and opened the next journal in the sequence, the shape of her father's life became more legible. The specific contours of his regret, the texture of his love, which was real and consistent, and had never, as far as she could determine, from the evidence of 24 years of private writing, been anything other than what it appeared to be. Genuine, unbroken, directed entirely at her. On the 4th morning she found the cabinet. It stood against the far wall of the underground room directly behind the door at the base of the stairs, positioned in a way that meant it was the first thing hidden by the door when it swung open. She had opened the door dozens of times over the past 3 days without looking behind it. She had not seen it until she came down the stairs and pushed the door closed behind her for the first time, instead of leaving it open. And when the door swung shut, the wall behind it came into view. The cabinet was 3 feet tall, built from dark oak with brass hardware that had been polished so many times over so many years that it had worn smooth at the points of most frequent contact. It was not large enough to hold anything significant in physical terms, but it was locked, which meant it held something significant in every other sense. She found the key in a tin marked personal in the back of the desk drawer beneath a folded road map of Augusta County and a small pocket knife. The tin was the kind sold in hardware stores, plain and functional, the kind no one looks twice at, the kind that is easy to overlook. She suspected that was deliberate. The key fit cleanly. The lock turned without resistance. She opened the cabinet door. Inside, sitting on the single shelf, was a wooden box approximately the size of a shoebox, made from the same dark oak as the cabinet itself. It had been built by hand, constructed with more care than strictly necessary for a container of its size. The joints fitted closely, the surfaces sanded to the point where the grain of the wood was visible as texture rather than roughness. It had a brass hinge at the back and a small brass clasp at the front. On the lid, carved into the wood in letters that went deep enough to be both intentional and permanent, was her name, Nora Calloway. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the box for a long time. Then she carried it to the desk, sat down, and opened the clasp. Inside were letters. Not a few, not a handful. Dozens and dozens of envelopes arranged vertically in neat rows, packed closely enough that the box held them without shifting, organized in a way that had required thought and care. The envelopes were of varying ages, the oldest ones yellow to the color of old cream, the newest ones still white, the gradation across the rows visible as a kind of timeline compressed into the dimensions of a wooden box. Each envelope had been addressed by hand in Harlan Calloway's careful formal writing. Each one bore a return address in Roanoke, Virginia. Each one had a stamp in the upper right corner, the specific stamp of its specific year, so that the row of envelopes was also incidentally a small postal history of the past 2 decades. Each one was sealed. She picked up the oldest envelope. The date written in the upper left corner was October 2000. The address was the Clover Hill Children's Home in Charleston, West Virginia. She was the addressee. She had been 2 months old. She turned the envelope over. It was sealed. It had never been opened. It had never been sent. She set it down and looked at the rows of envelopes. She picked up another from 2003, sealed, addressed to the same children's home. From 2006, addressed to a different location, a foster placement she did not recognize. From 2010, addressed to Clover Hill again because she had been returned by then and had stayed. From 2014, 2015, 2016, addressed to the Clover Hill Children's Home, where she had remained until she aged out of the system at 18. From 2018, addressed to a dormitory at Roanoke College. From 2021, from 2022, from 2023, addressed to the apartment on Maple Street where she still lived, where she had been living for the past 2 years. He had known her address for at least 2 years. He had not sent a single letter. She picked up the envelope from her most recent birthday, September 2023, addressed to her apartment in handwriting she had never seen before, finding these journals, and was only now beginning to understand how much she had inherited from a man she had met 4 times. She opened it. The paper inside was folded in thirds. She unfolded it. Dear Nora, today you turned 23. I have been trying to write this letter for 3 weeks, and I have started over 11 times, which is 11 more times than I have restarted most things in my life. And I am a man who spent 40 years in real estate development, which is a field that consists almost entirely of starting over. I do not know how to say what I want to say to you in a letter. I have been writing letters to you for 23 years, and I still do not know how to say it. Maybe that is the answer. Maybe some things cannot be said in letters, which would explain why I have written this many of them, and you have not received any of them. I am sorry. That sentence is not sufficient, but it is the most honest thing I know how to write today. She set the letter down on the desk's surface and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She was not crying. She had told herself she was not going to cry, which she understood was an almost entirely ineffective way of managing whether or not one cried, but she had made the decision and she intended to try to honor it. She picked up another letter, then another. She read them in order, starting from the earliest she could find, moving through the years in the sequence Harlan had written them. They were not all apologetic. Some of them were simply present. He wrote about the things he was thinking about in the weeks before her birthday each year, the way the light changed in September over the mountains, the progress of a project he was working on, a book he had recently read. He wrote as though he were writing to someone he expected to hear back from, someone in a regular correspondence, someone whose life was adjacent to his own. He wrote as though the distance were temporary. She was 3 envelopes into the folder beneath the letters when she found the documents. They were not hidden. They were simply at the bottom of the box beneath the envelopes in a folder that had been placed there deliberately, the last thing in the sequence. The folder was labeled Private Correspondence, and inside it were copies of things she had not expected to find. Legal documents, formal letters written on official stationery, certified mail receipts with tracking numbers, court filings, some of them stamped denied and some of them stamped petition withdrawn, and some of them stamped simply with a date and a case number that led nowhere. Requests for visitation, petitions for contact, letters from attorneys in Roanoke and from attorneys in Charleston and from a family mediator in Richmond who had apparently been engaged in 2004 and again in 2008, and whose involvement had apparently ended both times without resolution. There were response letters from another attorney, someone named Whitmore and Associates, which she recognized as the firm that represented Vera Calloway's personal affairs. The response letters were formal and brief and consistent in their message across multiple years and multiple attempts. The matter has been reviewed, and we do not believe further contact is in the best interest of the parties involved. Please direct any future correspondence to this office. And then she found the note. It was not a formal document. It was a handwritten note dated November 2018, written on a torn piece of notebook paper in Harlan's handwriting, more urgent than his journal entries, pressed and dark, as though the pen had been moving faster than usual. Prescott told me again today. He said bringing Nora into our lives now would undo everything we have built. He said she is 20 years old and has her own life, and I would only be disrupting it for my own benefit. He said it like he was protecting me. He has been saying some version of this for 15 years, and I have believed him for 15 years because it was easier than not believing him, and because I did not want to think about what it meant if he was wrong. But something about the way he said it today felt different. Something about his face when he said it. I have been a developer for 40 years. I know what a man looks like when he is protecting an interest. Nora set the note on the desk carefully. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the folder of legal documents again, and she began reading with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of someone absorbing grief, but the attention of someone building a picture from evidence. The specific, methodical attention of someone who had studied social work and understood better than most people how systems could be used to separate people who should not be separated. The pattern was not subtle when she was looking for it. The initial request for contact filed in 2001 had been routed through Whitmore and Associates and denied within weeks. The follow-up filings in 2004 had been met with a counter-petition arguing that contact was not in the child's developmental interest, a petition that had been signed by Vera Calloway and notarized by a member of the Whitmore firm. The 2008 attempt had gone slightly further, reaching a preliminary hearing before being withdrawn. In the withdrawal documentation, Harlan's attorney had noted client has been advised by family members that proceeding may cause irreparable harm to the minor child and has elected to withdraw pending further consideration. Family members. She found the document she was looking for near the back of the folder. It was a copy of a notarized declaration filed in 2001, signed as a supporting witness to the initial denial petition. The declarant attested that contact between Harlan Calloway and the minor child Nora Calloway would be disruptive and contrary to the child's stability and welfare. The signature at the bottom of the declaration read, Prescott Calloway. Below that, in the line reserved for the signatory's relationship to the parties, it read, son of petitioner, second-year law student. Nora sat back in the chair. Prescott had been 22 years old, second year of law school, old enough to understand exactly what he was signing and what effect it would have. He had not stumbled into this. He had contributed to it knowingly and formally at the very beginning before he had his law degree, before he had anything except the ambition of a young man who understood which side of his family's finances he intended to remain on. And he had continued for 22 years. She thought about the conference room in Roanoke, the way he had laughed, the way he had not looked at her when she entered. The quality of his disregard, which she now understood, had not been the careless indifference of a man who did not know her. It had been the practiced avoidance of a man who knew her situation precisely and had invested significant effort in keeping it exactly as it was. She closed the folder. She did not feel the anger she had expected to feel. She had anticipated it, the hot, destabilizing rage of someone discovering they have been deliberately deceived for the entirety of their existence. But what she actually felt was something quieter and colder. Not grief exactly, not yet, but something like the sensation of a very large and very old structure settling finally and completely into its foundation. The recognition of a shape that had always been there, visible now in its entirety for the first time. Her entire life had been organized around a false premise. The premise that she had been unwanted. The premise that Harlan Calloway had made his choices freely and had chosen a life that did not include her. She had constructed herself around that premise the way you construct a building around a load-bearing wall, making every decision of architecture and interior design with reference to that central feature. The wall had been placed there deliberately, by people who had benefited from its presence. She sat in the underground room for a long time after that. The lantern hummed. The cold of the stone held steady. Above her, through the floorboards, she could hear the wind moving through the clearing in long, slow passes. She thought about Harlan driving up this mountain road every month for 15 years. She thought about him sitting in his car on the opposite side of the street from her school, watching her laugh at the front gate, and then driving away because he had been told repeatedly by people he trusted that driving away was the right thing to do. She thought about what it cost a person to be that wrong about something that important for that long. She thought about what it cost the other person too. On the fifth morning, Amos Greer called the cabin phone. She had not known there was a cabin phone until it rang. It was a landline mounted to the kitchen wall, its cord coiled and slightly yellowed. She picked it up on the third ring. His voice carried no alarm, which was its own kind of reassurance. He said someone drove through town last night asking about the Callaway property. It was a man in a dark sedan with Roanoke plates. He stopped at the gas station and asked questions about who was living out there and whether the property had been listed for sale. Nora stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming through the window over the sink. She said, "What did you tell him?" Amos said, "I wasn't at the gas station. Dale was." Dale told him he didn't know anything about it, which is true because Dale doesn't know much about anything except the weather and bass fishing. She said, "Thank you, Amos." He said, "Be careful." And then he hung up because he was not a man who used more words than necessary. She spent the morning reading the final journals in the sequence, the ones from the last 5 years of Harlan's life. His handwriting had changed in these later volumes, the letters slightly less precise, the pen pressure lighter in some entries, and heavier in others, the physical record of a man whose relationship with his own body was becoming more complicated. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition in 2020. He wrote about it briefly and without drama, in the tone of someone noting a change in the weather. He adjusted his schedule. He worked less. He came to the cabin more often. He spent more time in the underground room. He organized the boxes. He labeled the journals. He built the wooden box with her name on it and filled it and arranged it carefully in the locked cabinet. He wrote in an entry from March 2022, "I have been thinking about the question of what a person leaves behind. Not property, not money. I have watched what money does to people who are not prepared for it, and I have no illusions about what it will do to my sons who have been preparing for it their entire lives in the wrong direction. What I want to leave behind is the truth. I want to leave behind proof that I was here, that she was here, that what happened between us was not what it appeared to be, and that some part of me was always pointed in her direction, even when I was walking away." The final journal entry was dated October 1st, 2023, 13 days before he died. She is 23 years old, and she is doing exactly what I always hoped she would do, which is to say she is building a life of her own on her own terms without any help from me, because she never had any help from me, and she learned to go without it, and she got very good at that, and I am proud of her for it, even though the pride has nowhere to go. I am leaving everything where she can find it. I am trusting that she will come, and that she will be strong enough to do something with what she finds, and that she will understand eventually that the cabin was never the inheritance. The truth was, I hope the truth is worth something to her. It is the only thing I have that is entirely mine to give. She was still sitting with that entry when she heard the car. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of tires on the road's surface carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The engine note of something larger and more powerful than her sedan, moving at a speed that suggested the driver was not uncertain about his destination. She climbed the stairs and closed the hatch and was standing at the kitchen window when the dark sedan came around the curve between the hemlocks. Prescott Calloway stepped out of the car. He was followed by a second man she did not recognize, who wore a suit that was slightly too formal for a mountain cabin in December and carried a leather portfolio case in a way that announced his profession. They both stood by the car for a moment, looking at the cabin in the assessing way of men who are looking at something they intend to acquire. Then Prescott looked at the kitchen window. He saw her. His expression did not change in any significant way. That was information. She put on her coat and went outside. The cold was sharp and clean. The clearing was bright with morning light on fresh snow, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and remorseless. She came down the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, and they stood perhaps 30 feet from each other in the snow. And for the first time in her life, she looked at her half-brother with the full knowledge of what he had done. He was 45 years old and he looked like the version of Harlan Calloway that money and comfort and the absence of regret produces. He was well-dressed and well-maintained, and he stood with the easy physical confidence of a man who had never had to perform that confidence because it had simply always been there. She had spent most of her life in the same room with men who looked like that and had learned to read them accurately. He was not here because he felt guilty. He was not here because he had reconsidered anything. He was here because there was something he wanted, and he had calculated that coming to get it was simpler than waiting for it to come to him. "Hello, Nora," he said. The way he said it suggested they were having a reasonable conversation between reasonable adults who happened to have a minor administrative disagreement to resolve. She said nothing. He introduced the second man whose name she immediately forgot as his legal representative. The man opened his leather portfolio and removed a document that he extended toward her with the slightly apologetic gesture of someone who is paid not to be apologetic. Prescott said with the measured patience of a man explaining something simple to someone he considers slow. "There's a complication with the property, specifically with the mineral rights. There's a pre-existing claim that Dad apparently never resolved, and it creates a legal ambiguity about the title. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just need access to the property while this gets sorted out. Which means we're asking you to vacate temporarily while our team comes in and does an assessment." She looked at the document. It was a temporary restraining order filed 2 days ago in Augusta County Circuit Court, signed by a judge whose name she did not recognize. It used language about title disputes and property access and good faith resolution in the practiced anesthetic style of legal documents designed to look procedural while doing something that was not. Prescott said, "I know this is a lot to deal with right away. Inheriting property is complicated, and Dad wasn't always organized about these things. We're just trying to help you avoid getting tangled up in something you don't have the resources to navigate alone." She looked at him. He was very good at this. She understood that now. He had been practicing this for 22 years, the art of saying things that sounded like concern while meaning the opposite of concern. He had practiced it on Harlan, who had trusted him, who had believed the version of reality Prescott constructed because he wanted to believe it, and because Prescott was his son, and because the alternative was a truth Harlan had not been ready to face until it was almost too late. She was not Harlan. She looked at Prescott steadily in the way she had learned to look at people who were trying to manage her response by managing her information. And she thought about the documents in the wooden box downstairs, the 22 years of legal filings, the signature on the 2001 declaration. She thought about what it had cost her to not know those things. She thought about what it had cost Harlan. She thought about 23 sealed envelopes addressed to her apartment in Roanoke, sitting in a box in a cabinet in a room 12 feet below the ground. Then she said clearly and without heat, because heat was not what this required, "You had 20 years to be honest with our father. You chose not to. That's a decision you'll spend the rest of your life with. This property is not something I'm going to discuss with you." Prescott's expression shifted very slightly. It was not anger. It was the recalibration of a man who had expected a different variable. He said, "I understand you're upset, but the legal situation is what it is, and ignoring a court order isn't going to make it go away." She said, "I'm not ignoring it. I have an attorney." The second man glanced at Prescott. She said, "I'd like you both to leave the property now. If you want to pursue the legal process, do it through the proper channels." There was a pause in which the mountain air held them all in place. The three of them standing in the snow in the December light with the cabin behind her and the dark sedan behind them, in 22 years of accumulated consequence, pressing against the conversation from all sides. Prescott looked at her for a long moment. She thought he might say something else. He had, she suspected, prepared something else, another layer of the argument, another version of the reasonable adult's approach. But something in what he saw when he looked at her appeared to alter his calculation. He nodded a small controlled movement. "We'll be in touch through your attorney," he said. Then he turned and walked back to the car, and the second man followed him, and the sedan reversed out of the clearing and disappeared around the curve in the trees. She stood in the snow until she could no longer hear the engine. Then she turned and looked at the cabin. The porch light was still on from the night before, burning pale in the morning brightness. The stone chimney was putting out a thin line of smoke. The snow on the roof was beginning to soften at the edges with the morning sun. The cabin looked exactly as it had looked when she first saw it standing at the edge of the clearing in the gathering dark of a December evening, old and specific and impossible to ignore. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and then picked up the landline and called the only local number she had, which was the number for Greer's General that she had found written on a piece of tape on the back of the phone itself. Amos answered on the second ring. She said it was Prescott Calloway. He came with a court order. Amos was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I figured it might be him." She said, "You knew he might come." He said, "Your father told me the last time he was here that he had a son who understood money better than he understood people. He said that was the most dangerous kind of person he knew of. He said he hoped you'd be ready for him." She looked out the kitchen window at the clearing where the tire tracks from Prescott's sedan were already filling with blown snow. She said, "Did my father say anything else?" Amos was quiet again. Then he said you were stronger than you knew. He said he thought that was probably his fault, that you never found out how strong you were, because strong people usually find out through difficulty, and the difficulty you had was the kind that makes people strong the hard way. She stood with the phone against her ear and the mountain light coming through the window. She said, "Thank you, Amos." He said, "There's a good attorney in Staunton, third-generation family law. Her grandmother handled property cases in Augusta County for 40 years. I have her number if you want it." She said she did. He gave it to her and then said goodbye the way he always said goodbye, which was simply by hanging up a habit she had come to find more comforting than elaborate farewells. She needed to call the attorney. She needed to understand the legal document Prescott had handed her and determine how much of it was real and how much of it was theater. She needed to understand what Heritage Land Trust meant and what Harlan had started in 2019 and how far along the process was and what it would take to complete it. She needed to do a number of practical, specific things that would require her full attention and the kind of focus she was good at. She would do all of those things. But first she went back downstairs. The wooden box was still on the desk, where she had left it, the lid still open. She looked at the remaining envelopes she had not yet read. There were perhaps 30 of them, left the ones from the middle years 2007 through 2015, the years when she had been between 8 and 15 years old, the years she most clearly remembered from the inside. She sat down. She reached into the box and found the envelope from September 2009, the one addressed to the Clover Hill Children's Home for her 9th birthday. She opened it. "Dear Nora, today you turn 9. I drove past the children's home this morning earlier than I should have, which meant I sat in my car on the street for almost an hour before the front door opened and the children started coming out. You were the 4th one through the door. You had a red coat that I did not recognize, which means it must be new or newer than last time I saw you. And it was too big for you, but you had pushed the sleeves up so your hands were free. You found a stick on the ground near the front steps, and you picked it up and were carrying it by the time you reached the sidewalk. I don't know what you were planning to do with the stick. You kept it for the half a block. I could see you walk, and then you turned the corner, and I couldn't see any more. I sat in my car for a while after that. I am not sure what I was doing. Waiting for something to become clearer, maybe. It hasn't yet. Happy birthday." She set the letter down. She picked up the next one. Outside, the wind had shifted and was coming now from the northwest, the direction that brought the serious winter weather off the ridgelines, and she could hear it moving against the stone walls of the underground room in a low, continuous register that was less a sound than a vibration. Something felt more than heard a mountain in December doing what mountains in December do. And then, sometime in the middle of the afternoon, she became aware of something she had not noticed in her focus on the letters. She became aware that the box was not quite empty. Beneath the final row of envelopes, pressed flat against the bottom of the wooden box, was something else. A single envelope, thicker than the others, unsealed with nothing written on the outside, except a single line in Harlan's handwriting, "When you are ready to know everything." She looked at it for a long time. She was not ready. She understood that clearly. She had read 24 years of journals and 30-something letters in 5 days, and she had absorbed more truth in that time than most people absorb in a decade. And there was still more in the boxes on the shelves that she had not gotten to, and she needed time before she took in anything else that was going to change the shape of what she understood. She placed the envelope back in the bottom of the box carefully and closed the lid. She left the box on the desk. She climbed the stairs and closed the hatch and stood in the kitchen and breathed the cabin air, cedar and fire and coffee, and the dry winter smell of old wood, and let the afternoon settle around her. She called the attorney in Staunton. A woman answered who sounded exactly as Amos had implied she would, precise and unhurried, someone who understood property cases in Augusta County the way surgeons understand a particular anatomy. She listened to Nora's description of the court order without interrupting. She asked 3 questions. She said she would need to see the document and would also need to see the property records before she could advise further. She said she had an opening the following Thursday. Nora said she would buy there. She stood in the kitchen after the call and looked out the window at the clearing. The afternoon light was going flat and gray, the way mountain light goes in December, losing its angle and spreading itself thin across the snow. The crows from the morning had returned and were doing what they had been doing before moving across the clearing with their purposeful, unhurried attention to the ground. Then there was a sound at the door. Not a knock exactly, more like a hesitation followed by a knock. The sound of someone who has raised their hand twice before the third time makes contact with wood. She crossed to the door and opened it. A woman stood on the porch. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a coat that was sufficient for the cold, but only barely the kind of insufficient coat that people wear when they did not know they were going to end up somewhere cold. She had a bag over one shoulder and nothing else. Her face was tired in a way that was not about lack of sleep. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been trying to hold something together through the force of their own will for long enough that the will is starting to give. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. Someone in town told me this place might," she stopped, took a breath, "might be able to help people who didn't have anywhere to go." Nora looked at her. She thought about Clara Calloway, whose photograph hung on the mantel, the white-haired woman standing beside Harlan in the summer sun, straight-backed and smiling, the woman who had started all of this long before either of them were born. She thought about Harlan writing in his journals about the meaning of the cabin, about what Clara had built here, and what it had meant across the generations it had served. She thought about the words on the back of the photograph. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in a too big red coat carrying a stick down a sidewalk in Charleston, West Virginia, turning a corner into a future nobody had prepared for her. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. The woman on the porch let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding for a very long time. She stepped across the threshold. Nora closed the door behind her, and the cold stayed outside where it belonged, and the fire in the stone fireplace threw its light across the room in long, warm intervals, and the cabin held them both without effort, the way it had been built to do, the way it had been doing for longer than either of them had been alive. Downstairs in the wooden box on the desk in the stone-walled room, the final envelope sat closed and waiting. Nora was not ready yet, but she was getting there. The woman's name was Kara. She did not explain her situation in detail, and Nora did not ask for details, having learned from her own history that some stories need to be offered rather than requested. What Nora understood was that Kara needed food and warmth, and a door that closed between her and whatever she was moving away from, and the cabin provided all of those things without conditions. Kara stayed 3 nights. On the morning of the 4th day, she folded the blankets she had used and left them precisely at the foot of the guest bed, and placed a note on the kitchen table, and was gone before the clearing had fully come into light. Nora found the note when she came downstairs. It said, "I was ready to give up when I found your door. You may never understand how much that night changed everything." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and carried it downstairs to the underground room and placed it in the box she had labeled 2024, the box she had started herself, the first one in the sequence that had not been filled by her father's hands. It was a small thing to do. It felt exactly right. Winter released its grip on the Appalachians slowly. the way it always does in those mountains, not all at once, but in increments, a degree of warmth here, a patch of exposed ground there. The process so gradual that you could not identify the exact moment when the season changed, but could only look up one morning and notice that the light was doing something different than it had been doing the week before. Nora noticed it on a Tuesday in early March. She was on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the clearing when she realized that the snow along the tree line had retreated several feet from where it had stood the previous week, and that the ground it had uncovered was dark and soft and ready. A thin line of green was visible at the base of the eastern tree line, the first tentative assertion of something that had been waiting underground all winter for exactly this moment. The sky above the ridge was a pale, clean blue that had not been present in December or January or February, a blue that belonged to a different season and had finally arrived to claim its proper place. She stood on the porch and looked at all of this and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that she was not waiting for something to end. She had been in Cedar Ridge for 3 months. The decision to stay had not been made in a single moment. It had accumulated the way most real decisions accumulate through small consecutive acts that only reveal themselves as a decision in retrospect. She had stayed one more day to read another journal. She had stayed another day to meet with the attorney in Staunton, a woman named Eleanor Vance whose grandmother had indeed handled property cases in Augusta County for 4 decades, and whose own understanding of Virginia land law was both comprehensive and exact. She had stayed another week while Eleanor reviewed the court documents and the Heritage Land Trust filings and the title history of the property. She had stayed through Christmas, which she spent at the cabin alone with a fire and a pot of soup and no particular sense of deprivation. She had stayed through January because the roads were bad and the underground room still held things she had not finished reading. And she had stayed through February because by that point she had stopped telling herself she was staying for a specific reason. She was staying because she was home. The cabin had changed in those 3 months, or perhaps more precisely, her relationship to the cabin had changed, which produced the same effect. She had repaired the porch boards, replacing the worst of them with lumber she sourced from a sawmill outside Staunton, and cut to length herself with a circular saw she borrowed from a man named Dale who ran the gas station in town and had more tools than he knew what to do with. She had caulked the windows and replaced 3 cracked panes and addressed the draft that had been coming through the gap between the north wall and the floor. She had fixed the kitchen shelves and repainted the walls of both upstairs bedrooms and rehung the front door on new hinges so that it opened and closed without the particular resistance that had suggested it was not entirely committed to the process. She had not done most of this alone. Cedar Ridge had opinions about the cabin, opinions that had been formed over 15 years of watching Harlan Calloway drive through town on the first weekend of every month and stop at Greer's General for coffee and supplies and conversation. The town had known him the way small communities know the people who show up consistently, which is to say completely and without the editing that formal relationships tend to require. They knew he had built the underground room in stages over many years, bringing materials up in his truck and working alone on weekends. They knew he kept the cabin in careful repair. They knew he was doing something up on that mountain that mattered to him in a way that his life in Roanoke apparently did not. And they had respected the privacy of it without making him feel observed, which is one of the things that small mountain communities do better than most places. When Nora arrived and it became clear she was staying, the town showed up. Not all at once and not with fanfare. It was quieter than that, more practical, and therefore more genuine. Dale appeared one Saturday with a truck full of insulation and spent 4 hours in the crawl space beneath the cabin without being asked and without accepting more than a cup of coffee in return. A woman named Margaret Tilson, who had lived in Cedar Ridge her entire 68 years and had the authority that comes from that kind of rootedness, arrived with a handwritten list of what needed to be done to the roof before the next winter and the name of the man in Waynesboro who did the best work at the most honest price. A younger man, 20-something, who Nora learned was Margaret's grandson, spent 3 consecutive Saturdays helping her replace the worst sections of the rail fence that marked the property boundary along the road. Amos came by most mornings. He rarely stayed long. He would lean on the porch railing and drink his coffee and say a few things that were worth saying and then go back to the store. His presence had the quality of something that had been happening for a long time and would continue happening for a long time, steady and undemonstrative in the way of certain things that are reliable precisely because they never announced their reliability. Others came to the cabin after Kara. Not many, not in those first months, but enough to establish a pattern. An elderly man from Churchville, whose truck had broken down on the mountain road in January, and who stayed 2 nights while his son drove up from Harrisonburg to collect him. A mother and her young son who appeared in February traveling south needing a place to wait out a storm that closed the roads for 36 hours. A veteran who came in March on foot, having walked up the mountain road from the bus stop in Waynesboro, who said only that he had heard about the place from someone he had met in a shelter in Roanoke, who had heard about it from someone else. The veteran's name was Garrett. He was 54 years old, and he had a face that had been through things in a sequence that had left marks. He stayed 4 days. He helped Nora replace the tarp over the woodpile and split 2 cords of oak that she had been meaning to get to. He did not talk much about himself. On the evening before he left, they sat on the porch in the late March warmth, and he said, looking out at the clearing, "Your father would have liked knowing you were here." She looked at him. "You knew him?" "Not personally," Garrett said, "but I spent a night at this cabin about 6 years back. He was here. He cooked dinner. He didn't ask me any questions I didn't want to answer. He said this place had been in his family for a long time, and he intended to keep it available for people who needed it. He said he hoped someone would carry it on after him." He looked at her sideways. "Looks like someone is," he said. She did not respond to that, but she thought about it after he left. She thought about it often in the weeks that followed. It was in the first week of April, a morning with genuine warmth in the sunlight, for the first time since the previous fall, that she found the federal documents. She had been working her way through the remaining boxes in the underground room in a systematic fashion, opening each one and reviewing its contents, building the complete picture of her father's life that the journals had started and the letters had deepened. Most of what she found confirmed what she already knew. Receipts and correspondence and personal records that added texture and detail to a story whose broad outlines she now understood. But in the box labeled 2019 near the bottom, beneath a folder of correspondence related to a building project in Roanoke that had apparently been complicated, she found a manila envelope with the seal of the United States Forest Service on the upper left corner. She opened it. The documents inside were formal and technical in the way of government paperwork, dense with the specific language of federal land management and conservation law. She read them slowly, going back over sections she did not immediately understand until the shape of what they described became clear. In August of 2019, Harlan Calloway had formally applied to enroll the 40 acres surrounding the cabin in the Heritage Land Trust Program, a federal conservation initiative that placed private land under a permanent easement, restricting development, extraction, and sale in exchange for certain tax benefits and the guarantee of long-term preservation. The application had been reviewed and approved in principle by the relevant regional office of the Forest Service. A final enrollment agreement had been prepared and sent to Harlan for signature. The agreement had never been signed. The envelope contained the unsigned agreement still in its original mailing envelope, along with a follow-up letter dated January 2020, noting that the signature page had not been returned and requesting that Harlan contact the office to confirm whether he wished to proceed. There was no record of a response. She sat at the desk and looked at the unsigned document for a long time. Then she reached for her phone and called Eleanor Vance. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was characteristic. Then she said, "How large is the parcel?" 40 acres. What's the terrain? Mixed hardwood forest mostly. Some limestone outcroppings along the northern boundary. A seasonal creek. There was a pause on Eleanor's end. Has anyone done a geological survey of the property? Nora said she didn't know. Eleanor said, "I'm going to make some calls this afternoon. I'll get back to you tomorrow." Eleanor called back the following morning. Her voice was the same as always, precise and unhurried, but there was something underneath it that had not been there before, a quality of carefully managed significance. She said, "I had someone run the mineral rights records for your parcel. There was a geological survey done in 2018, commissioned by a company called Ridgeline Resource Partners. They found a significant deposit of rare earth minerals on the northern 40 acres. Based on current market valuations, the extractable reserves are estimated at somewhere between $3 and $5 million. Nora said nothing. Eleanor said the company that commissioned the survey, Ridgeline Resource Partners. It was incorporated in Delaware in 2017. The registered agent is a law firm in Roanoke. Nora said, "Which law firm?" Eleanor gave her the name. It was not Whitmore and Associates. It was a different firm, smaller, specializing in commercial real estate and corporate formation. But when Eleanor read her the names of the principals listed in the corporate documents, the second name on the list was Prescott Calloway. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of statement. She said he knew. Eleanor said he's known since at least 2018 when the survey was commissioned. And the timing of the Heritage Land Trust application is interesting. Your father filed the application in August 2019, about 10 months after the survey was completed. The Forest Service approved it in principle within 4 months. Nora said, and then the signature page was never returned. Eleanor said, the follow-up letter went to your father's home address in Roanoke in January 2020. She thought about Vera. She thought about the efficiency with which mail can disappear in a household where someone is paying attention to what arrives. She said, what happens if I complete the enrollment now? Eleanor said, the program accepts applications from new owners when property transfers occur. There will be paperwork and it will take time, but the original approval is on record and it can be referenced. The deposit would become legally unextractable in perpetuity. No mining permit could be issued. No surface rights could be sold. Nora looked at the unsigned document on the desk in front of her. She looked at her father's name printed at the bottom of the signature page, the line beneath it, waiting, and beneath that, the date field blank. She said, tell me what I need to do. Eleanor told her. It was not simple and it was not fast, but Eleanor had done similar things before, and she outlined the process with the clarity of someone who has navigated bureaucratic systems long enough to understand which parts of them are genuinely complicated and which parts only appear complicated because they want to discourage people who are not paying close attention. Nora was paying very close attention. She spent the next 4 weeks working through the enrollment process with Eleanor's guidance. There were forms and supporting documents and a site visit from a Forest Service representative. A quiet man in his 50s named Cartwright, who walked the boundary of the property with her on a Wednesday morning in late April and asked careful questions about the land use history and said very little else. There were communications with the regional office and a title search and a legal review of the easement terms that Eleanor handled with the focused efficiency of someone doing work she believes in. And then on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of April, Nora signed the enrollment agreement. She signed it at the kitchen table in the cabin with Eleanor on the phone, and when the notarized documents were sent to the Forest Service office in Charlottesville, the 40 acres surrounding the Calloway cabin on the mountain above Cedar Ridge became permanently and irrevocably protected land. No survey, no extraction, no sale for the purpose of development or mineral harvest. The land would remain exactly as it was for as long as the program existed, and almost certainly longer. Prescott's company had spent money on a geological survey and years on a strategy built around a land parcel that was now legally and permanently beyond the reach of any extraction permit he might pursue. She did not feel triumph when she set down the pen. What she felt was quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of something being completed, a task that had been started and interrupted and left unfinished for years, and was now done, the satisfaction of closing something that had been left open. Not for her benefit exactly, but because it was right, because Harlan had started it and it needed to be finished, and she was the one who was here to finish it. She said to Eleanor, thank you. Eleanor said, your father started the right process. You finished it. Then she said, the court filing. Prescott brought in December. I've been reviewing it in light of what we found. The claim about mineral rights and title ambiguity was not entirely fabricated, but it was significantly overstated, and given what we now know about Ridgeline Resource Partners and his stake in that company, there's a reasonable argument for bad faith litigation. I think we should file a response. Nora said file it. She went outside after the call and stood in the clearing in the late April afternoon looking at the tree line, where the hardwoods had come into their early spring green, a color so immediate and alive after the months of gray and brown and white that it seemed almost implausible. A hawk was working the updrafts above the southern ridge, moving in long, slow circles that required no effort, just the willingness to find the right current and trust it. She thought about Prescott. She thought about what it would cost him, not just the money, though the money was real and the loss of it was real and the years of planning that had produced nothing were real. She thought about what it cost a person to spend 2 decades managing a lie, building a structure of deception so elaborate that it requires constant maintenance. The way certain houses require constant maintenance because they were built wrong in the first place, and the only way to keep them standing is to never stop working on them. She did not feel sorry for him, but she did not feel the hot, clean satisfaction she had once imagined feeling back in the days when she had still believed the story about herself, the story in which she had been discarded and would one day prove that the discarding had been a mistake. That story was gone now, replaced by something more complicated and more accurate. And the complicated, accurate version did not have much room for the kind of triumph that requires a defeated opponent standing in front of you. She went back inside and went downstairs. The wooden box was on the desk where she had left it, the lid closed. She sat down and picked it up and opened it and took out the final envelope, the thick one that had been pressed flat against the bottom of the box since December, the one with a single line written on the outside in her father's handwriting. When you are ready to know everything. She held it in her hands for a moment. The lantern hummed softly. The stone walls held their cold. Above her, through the floorboards, the fire in the stone fireplace was putting out the patient, reliable heat that fires put out when they have been properly built and given enough fuel. She opened the envelope. The pages inside were not in a single fold like the other letters. There were several of them covered on both sides in Harlan's handwriting, the letters more deliberate than in the recent journals, written with the care of someone who has been through many drafts and has finally arrived at the version they intend to stand behind. The date at the top of the first page was September 2023, 3 weeks before he died. Dear Nora, I have been trying to write this particular letter for longer than I have been writing all the others combined. The others were difficult because I did not know how to say what I wanted to say. This one is difficult because I know exactly what I need to say, and I have spent too many years being afraid to say it. I am going to try now to say it clearly, and I am going to ask you to read it to the end before you decide what to do with it. She turned the page. Your mother's name was Catherine. Catherine Reeves, before she took my name, which she did in the spring of 1998, 2 years before you were born. She was 31 years old, and she had grown up in Charlottesville, and she had a way of looking at things, ordinary things, a cup of coffee, a road in the morning light, a book left open on a table that made them seem more specific and more worth noticing than they had seen before. She was the most genuinely attentive person I have ever known. I loved her in the way that people love things that they do not fully understand they have until they are gone. She died in October of 2000, 2 days after you were born. The doctors called it a complication of childbirth. That is accurate in its way, but it is the kind of accuracy that leaves everything important out. What happened was that she was here, and then she was not here, and the world I had been living in rearranged itself around that absence so completely and so quickly that I did not know how to exist in it. You were 2 days old. I was not capable in those first weeks and months of being your father in any meaningful sense. That is the honest truth, and I am not offering it as an excuse. I was not capable of very much of anything. I made decisions in that period that I have spent the 23 years since then regretting in the way you regret things that cannot be undone. I allowed people to make decisions for me. I allowed Vera, who I married 2 years later for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time, and that I understand now were not reasons at all, but simply motion. The forward motion of a man who does not know how to stand still in his grief. I allowed Vera to convince me of things about you that were not true. She told me you were better off without the disruption of a father who would never be consistent. She told me that children in your situation needed stability above everything else, and that a father who was present sometimes and absent others was worse than a father who was simply absent. She said this with such conviction that I chose to hear it as wisdom rather than strategy, because hearing it as strategy would have required me to admit what I had already begun to suspect, which was that the woman I had married was not interested in what was best for you. She was interested in what was convenient for her family. Prescott understood this before I did. He was 22 when you were born, and he already had even then the intelligence of a person who understands how power moves within a family and positions himself accordingly. He did not act against you out of hatred. I want you to understand that because I think it is important. He acted against you out of calculation. You were a variable that complicated the equation of his inheritance. And he addressed the variable with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. I should have seen it. I did not want to see it, which is not the same thing, but produces the same result. She turned to the next page. What I want you to know, and what I should have found a way to tell you years ago, is this. You were not a consequence of loss. You were not a reminder of grief or a complication or a mistake or any of the other things that the people around me allowed me to half believe in the years when I was not strong enough to think clearly. You were the last thing your mother gave to the world, and she gave things to the world with great deliberateness. She was not a careless person. She did not do things accidentally. I drove past your school in the fall of 2006 because I needed to see you. I had been telling myself for 6 years that staying away was the right thing, the responsible thing, the thing that protected you from the disruption of my inconsistency. I believed that because it was easier to believe than the alternative. But something happened that year, something I cannot explain precisely. I simply needed to see you. I needed to know that you were real and present and in the world. You were standing at the front gate of your school with another girl. You were laughing at something she had said, your whole face involved in it, the laugh of a person who finds things genuinely funny rather than performing amusement for an audience. And I sat in my car on the other side of the street, and I thought, she is not a reminder of what I lost. She is proof that love survives even when everything else falls apart. I came back every month after that. Not always to your street, not always close. Sometimes I just came to Cedar Ridge and walked the property and sat in the cabin and thought about you. But I came back because it was the closest I knew how to get to doing the right thing, which I understand now was not close enough. The cabin is not an apology. I am not capable of offering you an apology equal to what is owed. What the cabin is, what I hope it becomes, is a continuation of something that was started long before either of us was born by people who understood that the purpose of a place is not to hold possessions, but to hold people. Clara understood that. Your mother understood it. I understood it too late and too incompletely. I am trusting that you will understand it in time. You are the right person for this, not because you are my daughter, though you are, and I am grateful for that beyond my ability to say it. You are the right person because you know what it is to need a door that opens. You have spent your entire life knowing that in the way that only people who have stood on the wrong side of closed doors can know it. That knowledge is not a wound. Or it is a wound, but it is also the thing that makes you capable of keeping this place. Keep the fire burning, Nora. Not for me, for whoever comes next. Your father. She set the pages down on the desk. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the stone wall of the underground room and allowed what she had read to settle into her the way that true things settle, not quickly and not without resistance, but with the eventual completeness of something that has found the place it was always looking for. Her mother's name was Catherine. Catherine Reeves had looked at ordinary things and made them more specific. She had loved Harlan Calloway in the full sense of the word, the sense that leaves a mark on the person you loved, even after you are no longer there to make it. And she had given Nora to the world with the same deliberateness she brought to everything else. She had not been careless. She had not done things accidentally. Nora had spent 24 years understanding herself as a person who had been left. She had built her entire interior architecture around that understanding. She had made it functional, and she had made it strong, and she had survived on it in the way that people survive on difficult truths. Because difficult truths are still truths, and truth is what the mind requires to work properly. But the truth she had been surviving on was not complete. It was the part of the story that was visible from the outside, the part that could be observed by someone who did not have access to what was underneath. The complete truth was larger and more complicated, and contained within it something she had never allowed herself to look for, because looking for it had seemed like the kind of hoping that destroys people when it comes to nothing. She had not been discarded. She had been loved at a distance imperfectly and at great cost by a man who had not been strong enough to do it right and had spent the rest of his life trying to find another way. She had been born from a love that had ended in grief, and she had been sent forward into a world that had not been kind to her, and she had survived it and built herself from what was available. And the woman she had become was as her father had written in the pages she was holding. Exactly the right person for this. She stayed at the desk for a long time. The lantern continued its soft hum. The fire above her continued its patient burning. Outside the first of the evening, birds had begun, and she could hear them through the floorboards, the thin, clear sound of something small and alive, making its presence known in the gathering dark. Eventually, she climbed the stairs. The cabin received her the way it always did now, with the smell of cedar and wood smoke and the warmth of the fire. The warmth of a place that has been lived in consistently by someone who keeps the fire burning. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it. The repaired floorboards, the freshly painted walls of the stairway, the bookshelves with their organized contents supplemented now by her own books, interleaved with Harlan's so that it was no longer possible to tell clearly where his collection ended and hers began. She went to the fireplace and stood before it. The photograph of Harlan and the white-haired woman was still on the mantel where she had first found it, the frame clean now, the image clear. Harlan, on a summer day younger than she had known him, relaxed in a way she had only seen in photographs. Clara Calloway beside him, straight-backed and smiling, the woman who had started all of this in the way that certain people start things. Not with grand gestures, but with the decision to open a door and the consistency to keep it open. Keep the fire burning. She had seen those words on the back of this photograph on her first night in the cabin. She had not understood them then as anything more than a sentiment, the kind of phrase that appears on the backs of photographs in families that have a way with words. She understood them now as what they were, an instruction passing from one generation to the next. The most essential instruction the cabin had to offer, more essential than any practical knowledge contained in the journals or legal significance embedded in the Heritage Land Trust documents. Keep the fire burning, not the fire in the fireplace specifically, though that too. The fire of availability, the fire of a door that stays open, the fire of a place where the question is never why are you here, but only come in. She went to the barn behind the cabin, the old wooden structure that she had not fully explored in her first weeks but had eventually come to know as well as the rest of the property. In the back corner beneath a tarp that had partially disintegrated with age, she had found a wooden sign some weeks earlier. It was a large sign, perhaps 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall, made from a single thick plank of chestnut, the kind of wood that had stopped being available in American forests a century ago. The paint on its surface had almost entirely faded, the letters visible only in certain light and at certain angles. She had brought it inside in early April, set it against the kitchen wall, and spent 3 evenings carefully cleaning it and then applying a fresh coat of dark paint in the same letters, tracing the originals as closely as she could. She carried it now to the fireplace. She had installed 2 hooks above the mantel the previous week, knowing she was going to do this, knowing the sign needed to go here. She lifted it and set it on the hooks and stepped back. The letters were clear and dark against the chestnut wood. Keep the fire burning. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Amos knocked at the door just before 7, as he had been doing every few evenings since March. He came in, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, with the familiarity of a man who has been doing it long enough that it no longer requires an invitation, and came to stand beside her in front of the fireplace. He looked at the sign. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your father looked for that sign for years. He thought it had been lost in a barn fire sometime in the 50s. He built a replica of it once, but it never felt right to him. He said the original was the original. Nora looked at the sign. It had been in the barn the whole time. Amos said sometimes things wait where you left them. They stood together in front of the fire for a while without speaking. This was something she had come to appreciate about Amos Greer, his capacity for comfortable silence, the way he occupied a room without filling it, the way his presence felt like company without requiring anything of you. The fire shifted and resettled, sending a brief brightness across the room that caught the edges of the sign and the frame of the photograph and the spines of the books on the shelves. Then he said, "There's also this." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "Gerald Whitfield sent it to my address," he said. "Said he found it in your father's private papers after the initial estate processing was finished. Said it was addressed to you." She took the envelope. The handwriting on the front was Harlan's. She said, "When did this arrive?" Amos said. "3 days ago. I wanted to wait until the right moment." She held it for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter inside was brief, only a single page, written in the final weeks of Harlan's life. The handwriting was lighter than she had seen in the earlier journals, the letter smaller, the pen moving with less force. But it was careful. Everything her father wrote was careful. "Grace," it began, and then she saw he had crossed that word out and written Nora above it, as though he had nearly used the wrong name, as though at the very end, when he was most tired, some older word for her had surfaced from wherever words like that live. "Nora, I know my sons will take everything they can see. The house on the lake, the accounts, the ranch. Let them. Because what I am giving you was never meant for them, and they would not know what to do with it if it were. I left it to you because you understand something they will never learn, regardless of how much time they are given. And that is what it feels like to need something that no amount of money can provide. You know what it is to stand outside looking in. And because you know that, you will never close a door on someone who is standing where you have stood. The cabin is not a consolation prize. It never was. It is the most important thing I own, and I am leaving it to the only one of my children who will understand why. Keep the fire burning. Not for me, for whoever comes next." She folded the letter. She stood at the mantel for a long time, the letter held loosely in one hand, the fire warm on her face. Outside, the evening had settled fully over Cedar Ridge, the stars beginning to show in the dark above the ridge. The clearing was quiet and silver with the last of the day's reflected light. Amos waited unhurried the way he waited for everything. She said finally, "He was right, about all of it." Amos nodded once. "He usually was," he said. "About this place, anyway." In the weeks that followed, the spring deepened into itself. The mountains went fully green in the way that mountain springs go green comprehensively and quickly, as though making up for the months of restraint. The creek at the bottom of the property ran fast and cold with snowmelt. The birds came back to the clearing, the familiar ones she had learned to recognize over the winter, and new ones passing through on their way to somewhere else, stopping in the hemlocks for a day or a week before continuing north. Word continued to spread through the valley slowly and without any particular announcement. Nora had not advertised the cabin. She had not posted anything or placed any notices or told anyone outside of Cedar Ridge that the place was available for people who needed it. But the information moved the way information moves in rural communities, through conversations at gas stations and general stores and church parking lots, through the network of people who know other people who might need exactly this kind of thing. A man named Ted arrived in May, referred by a pastor in Waynesboro who had heard from a family he served. Ted was 67 and had been evicted from his rental in Staunton when the property was sold, and had nowhere to go while he waited for his name to reach the top of a housing assistance list. He stayed 2 weeks. He was a skilled woodworker, and during his stay he repaired the broken section of the stair railing with a precision that was beautiful to watch and produced a result significantly better than the original. A young couple came in early June, traveling through with a car that needed a repair they couldn't afford. They stayed 3 nights. The man fixed the corroded pipe fitting under the kitchen sink that had been slowly dripping since February and that Nora had been meaning to address. His wife helped her plant a kitchen garden along the south-facing wall of the cabin, which got the best light, and had been sitting as bare dirt since the snow receded. Each person who came left something behind, not always in the material sense, though, sometimes that too. They left the trace of having been present in a place and having been received there without judgment, a trace that accumulates in a structure over time and changes the quality of the air within it, the way decades of wood smoke change the quality of a chimney, or decades of fires change the color of a stone hearth. The cabin was becoming something. It had been something before she understood that it had been something since Clara had first made it into a place where no one was turned away, and it had remained something through the generations and through the years when Harlan had kept it open quietly and without ceremony. But it was becoming something again in the present tense, something active rather than preserved. And the difference between those two states was measurable in the quality of the mornings, in the way the fire felt when she lit it, in the sense she had each day of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She had not felt that before. She had not known it was possible to feel it. Eleanor Vance called in late June with a progress report on the legal proceedings. The response to Prescott's court filing had been submitted. His attorneys had reviewed the Heritage Land Trust enrollment and the disclosure of Ridgeline Resource Partners and had requested an extension to prepare their response, which Eleanor interpreted as a sign that they were reconsidering the viability of the position. She said she expected the matter to resolve without a trial, most likely through a withdrawal of the initial filing. She also said in the same breath that she had spoken with a colleague who handled estate disputes and that there were grounds for a civil action related to the interference with Harlan's attempts to establish contact over the years. The documents in the wooden box, the legal filings, the certified mail records, the signed declaration from 2001 constituted a substantial evidentiary record. She said she would leave that decision entirely to Nora. Nora said she would think about it. She did think about it. She thought about it for several days, walking the property in the early mornings when the air was cool and the dew was still on the grass and the mountains were doing their enormous, unhurried thing. She thought about what it would cost in time and energy and the quality of attention that legal proceedings require and absorb. She thought about what she would be building if she pursued it and what she would be building if she did not. She called Eleanor back on a Thursday morning and said, "File it. Not for the money, for the record. I want there to be a record." Eleanor said, "There will be a record." She thought about Prescott after she hung up. She had heard from Amos, who heard things through the osmosis of small-town information networks that reach further than their apparent range, that the relationship between Prescott and Reed had deteriorated significantly in the months since the estate was distributed. There had been disagreements about assets and about the management of what remained of the Callaway holdings in Roanoke. There had been a dispute about money that had become a dispute about something larger, the kind of dispute that happens between people who have built their relationship on a shared project and then discover that the project is not what they thought it was. She thought about Reed, who she had known least of all and who had always existed in Prescott's considerable shadow. She wondered if he was relieved by any of it. She wondered if there was a version of Reed Callaway that had been waiting for the structure to fall so that he could figure out who he was without it holding him in place. She did not know. She might never know. She had accepted that there were aspects of this family she would not have access to, that the knowledge she had found in the underground room was complete in some respects and partial in others, and that the partial parts would have to remain partial because she could not spend her life pursuing the full accounting when there was something else that needed her, something that needed the fire. Amos brought the box to the porch one evening in late July. A wooden box, not large, hand-joined at the corners with careful dovetail construction that announced it had been made by someone with tools and time and the inclination to do the thing right. He set it on the porch railing and said, "Town put this together for you." She opened it. Inside were papers, dozens of them, some folded, some not, some written on notebook paper, and some on the backs of envelopes, and some on plain white printer paper. She took the topmost one out and read it. It was from Ted the woodworker, written in the careful script of a man who had been taught penmanship in a different era. He said he was in his new housing now, a small apartment in Staunton, with a window that looked east toward the mountains. He could not see from where he was, but knew were there. He said the railing on the cabin stairs had needed to be a particular wood, and he was glad he had the right piece in his truck. She read through a dozen more notes before she had to stop. Not because they were too much, but because they were exactly enough, which was its own kind of too much. She looked at Amos. He was leaning on the porch railing in his characteristic way, coffee in hand, looking at the clearing. He said, "Your father used to say that this place worked because it didn't try to be more than it was. It was just a cabin with a fire and an open door. He said that was all any place needed to be to matter." She looked at the clearing. The summer evening light was coming across it at a long angle. The late day light of July in the mountains, golden and specific, making the grass look illuminated from below. The tree line was deep green. Above the southern ridge, a few clouds were assembling themselves into shapes that suggested tomorrow might bring rain. She said he was right about that. Amos nodded. He usually was, he said. About this place anyway. She thought about what it meant to be right about a place. She thought about the 40 acres above Cedar Ridge, and what they were now, and what they would remain protected and permanent. The trees and the creek and the limestone outcroppings, and the quality of the air at that elevation. The thing that had drawn Clara here first, and had drawn Harlan back month after month, and had drawn Nora up this mountain road in a snowstorm in December, in her aging sedan with no signal on her phone, and no clear idea of what she was looking for. She had found it. Not the cabin, though the cabin was real and mattered. Not the land, though the land was worth protecting, and she had protected it. Not even the truth, though the truth had changed everything she had believed about herself, and would continue to change her in ways she had not yet finished discovering. What she had found was simpler than all of those things, and more durable. She had found the beginning of an understanding of who she was when she was not defined by what she had lost. Who she was when the story she carried about herself was not the story of a person who had been left, but the story of a person who had come back to a place that needed her. The first snow of the new winter fell in early November. She saw it from the porch in the morning before full light, the flakes small and tentative. The sky the gray that announces snow in the mountains hours before it arrives, and then finally delivers on its announcement. She stood in her coat with her coffee and watched it come down across the clearing, covering the grass in a thin preliminary layer, the beginning of another winter. Amos came up the road on foot, which he did sometimes in the early mornings, when the weather was not yet serious enough to require the truck. He came up the porch steps and accepted the coffee she had already poured for him, and they stood together at the railing. The snow fell. The clearing filled with it slowly, the familiar process of the landscape preparing itself for the long, patient months ahead. The tree line stood dark against the white and gray of the sky. The mountains beyond it were invisible in the clouds, present but unseen, which was not the same as absent. Catherine Reeves had looked at ordinary things and made them more specific. Harlan had driven up this road every month for 15 years, doing the only thing he had found that brought him close to what he could not reach. Clara had started all of this with nothing more than the decision to open a door and the consistency to keep it open. And then there were the others. Kara on the porch in December, her breath held so long before it finally released. Garrett walking up from the bus stop with his worn boots and his quiet dignity. Ted with his careful hands and the right piece of wood in his truck. All of them, and whoever would come next, because there would be a next, and then another after that, because the need for an open door does not diminish over time. It recurs in different people, in different forms, as regularly and reliably as winter. She went inside. The fire needed another log, and she added one, watching the flames reassert themselves around the new wood with the efficient certainty of something that knows exactly what it is doing. The underground room was closed. The wooden box was on the shelf where she had placed it. The letters from Harlan inside it, along with all the others, the lid closed, the brass clasp latched. The boxes on the shelves held their 24 years of careful record. The walls held the cold out. The fire held the warmth in. Above the mantel, the sign looked back at her in its dark letters on chestnut wood. Keep the fire burning. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned to the kitchen to start breakfast, because people would be coming today or tomorrow or the day after, and the fire needed to be burning when they arrived. And there was work to do before then, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.